January 20th, 2026, just after dawn in London, while most of the city was still moving through an ordinary winter morning, a statement from Buckingham Palace cut through the calm with surgical precision. Within minutes, it was everywhere: newsrooms, legal circles, royal watchers on both sides of the Atlantic. And the message was not vague, it was not diplomatic, it was final. Buckingham Palace had formally rejected every reported demand made by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle ahead of their expected court appearances in Britain. Not partially dismissed, not quietly negotiated. Rejected completely, publicly, and in language that leaves almost no room for interpretation. The position was stark. No active or former member of the royal household is permitted to claim any representative role, ceremonial authority, or institutional standing on behalf of the crown in connection with private legal matters. Stripped of formal phrasing, the meaning is blunt. Whatever happens next in court, Harry and Meghan stand there alone, not as envoys, not as defenders of the monarchy, and certainly not with the palace behind them. This is where the story changes, because until now, much of the public narrative around Harry and Meghan has existed in a kind of blurred space, half in, half out of the royal system. Even after stepping back from official duties, there remained a lingering ambiguity. Titles were retained. Connections were assumed. The possibility, however distant, that lines of communication still existed behind closed doors. That ambiguity is now gone. What happened this morning was not just a refusal. It was a line drawn in full view of the world. And it raises an immediate, uncomfortable question. What exactly triggered a response this definitive? Palace language is rarely accidental. Every word is weighed, measured, and calibrated to signal without escalating. Yet this time, the tone carried something sharper, something closer to containment than caution. It suggests that whatever was requested behind the scenes did not simply cross a boundary. It threatened one. Because this is no longer about interviews or documentaries or even the fallout from a memoir. This is happening in a courtroom. And courtrooms operate on a different level of risk. Claims are tested. Evidence is demanded. Allegations, once spoken under legal scrutiny, carry consequences that cannot be softened by public relations or reframed through narrative. If Harry and Meghan were attempting directly or indirectly to link their case to the authority of the crown, even symbolically, the implications would be serious. It would blur the line between private grievance and institutional involvement. It would invite questions not just about media conduct, but about the role of the monarchy itself. And that is precisely what Buckingham Palace appears determined to prevent. Legal analysts have already begun to point out the significance of the timing. With court proceedings imminent, any ambiguity about representation could become a liability. If a claimant is perceived to be acting with institutional backing, it changes the weight of the case. It shifts expectations. It invites scrutiny far beyond the individuals involved. By stepping in now, the palace is doing more than distancing itself. It is preemptively closing a door. There is also the matter of precedent. The modern monarchy has faced controversy before public disputes, media battles, internal tensions, but a situation where a senior royal figure engages in high-stakes litigation while appearing to invoke royal authority from outside the institution is something far more complex. It challenges the very structure that separates personal identity from public duty. And structures like that are not designed to bend. Which is why the reaction this morning feels less like routine damage control and more like a controlled detonation contained, deliberate, but undeniably powerful. Behind the scenes, according to multiple reports, the atmosphere has been anything but calm. Words like frustration, concern, and finality are being used with increasing frequency, not because this conflict is new, but because the context has changed. The battlefield has shifted from media narratives to legal reality. And in that arena, the stakes are higher, the risks sharper, and the consequences far less predictable. For Harry and Meghan, this moment represents something critical. Without the shadow or protection of institutional alignment, every claim, every argument, every piece of evidence will stand or fall on its own merit. There is no symbolic buffer. No royal association to soften perception, only the case itself. And that may be exactly what the palace wants. Because once the line is drawn this clearly, there is no confusion left to manage, no mixed signals to interpret, only a single, unmistakable message: this is not our fight. But if that is true, then it leads to a far more explosive question. What exactly did Harry and Meghan ask for that forced the palace to answer like this? What forced Buckingham Palace to draw such a hard line may come down to a set of reported demands that if even partially accurate, push far beyond routine security or logistical requests and into something far more sensitive: status, symbolism, and control. According to multiple palace-linked briefings and media leaks, Meghan Markle's legal team submitted an extensive list of conditions ahead of her expected return to London. On the surface, some of these requests can be framed as security precautions. High-profile individuals involved in contentious legal battles often require elevated protection. But it is the scale, the layering, and the tone of these alleged demands that have triggered such a strong institutional response. The list reportedly begins with the lockdown of multiple floors in a luxury hotel, not just privacy, but full isolation, controlled access points, staff cleared and monitored, movement in and out tightly restricted. From there, the requirements escalate: enhanced personal security, specialized protective arrangements at any venue she might attend, and the availability of armored transport options throughout her stay. Then comes the operational footprint: a fleet of high-end vehicles, a personal support entourage, coordinated movement planning resembling that of a visiting head of state rather than a private individual attending court proceedings. For British authorities already balancing public resources and security protocols, this alone raises practical and political questions. But the most controversial element is not physical, it is symbolic. Among the reported conditions is the insistence that Meghan be addressed as Her Royal Highness. That phrase carries weight far beyond etiquette. It represents formal standing within the royal structure, a standing that, under the agreement reached in early 2020, the Sussexes agreed not to use in practice after stepping back from official duties. Reintroducing it now, even in a limited or situational context, is not a small request. It touches directly on one of the monarchy's most guarded fault lines: who holds authority, who represents the institution, and who has the right to use its most powerful symbols. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how the monarchy functions. Titles are not just ceremonial, they are signals of duty, of hierarchy, of responsibility. They define who speaks for the crown and who does not. And once those lines blur, even slightly, the consequences ripple outward. This is where the situation shifts from logistical tension to strategic conflict. Because if Meghan's team is attempting to secure conditions that mirror official royal treatment while simultaneously operating outside the structure of working royal duties, it creates a contradiction that is difficult for the palace to ignore. On one hand, distance from the institution. On the other, selective proximity when it offers advantage. Public relations experts have already begun weighing in, and their assessments are strikingly consistent. This is not just about safety. It is about positioning, about controlling the narrative before it even enters the courtroom, about framing presence, status, and perception in a way that influences how the entire legal battle is interpreted. And then there is the moment that shifted everything from behind-the-scenes negotiation into public confrontation. Shortly before departing from Los Angeles, Meghan reportedly made a statement that immediately caught the attention of both media and critics. She described her return to Britain as one made with her crown intact. A single phrase, but one loaded with implication. Because in the language of royalty, the word crown is not metaphorical. It is institutional. It represents continuity, authority, and legitimacy. To claim it, even rhetorically, while standing outside the formal structure of the monarchy, is to step directly into contested territory. Critics were quick to react. Some framed the statement as provocative, even defying a signal that Meghan intends to reclaim not just visibility but symbolic power. Others interpreted it as strategic messaging, designed to reinforce her identity at a moment when legal scrutiny threatens to redefine it. Supporters, however, see something different. To them, it is an assertion of resilience, a refusal to be diminished or erased. A declaration that stepping back from royal duties does not mean surrendering personal identity. But regardless of interpretation, the effect is the same. The optics become impossible to ignore. Because now the story is no longer just about a court case. It is about image versus institution, about who controls the narrative when private individuals carry public titles, and about whether those titles can be separated from the authority they once represented. Inside palace circles, the reaction, according to multiple reports, has been sharp. Not just concern, but frustration. Because from their perspective, this is not a misunderstanding. It is a direct challenge to the boundaries that were carefully negotiated years ago. And once those boundaries are tested in public, the palace has only one option: respond clearly, or risk losing control of the framework entirely. Which brings us to the deeper issue, one that goes far beyond hotel security or forms of address. Because behind these demands, behind the symbolism, behind the carefully constructed optics, there is a legal case unfolding, one that does not just target the press, but threatens to expose something much larger. Behind the optics, behind the security demands and the symbolic language, there is a legal case taking shape that could reach far beyond a dispute with the press. At its core, Prince Harry's claim is not simply that the media behaved aggressively or unfairly. It is that there was a sustained, coordinated pattern of intrusion, one that may have crossed legal boundaries and, more explosively, may have been enabled by relationships that extend closer to the royal institution than anyone is comfortable admitting. According to filings and reporting surrounding the case, the allegations include unlawful information gathering, targeted briefings designed to shape public perception, and the strategic use of private details in ways that could constitute a violation of privacy law. These are serious claims on their own, but what elevates this case into something far more dangerous is the suggestion that the machinery behind those actions was not entirely external. The argument, as presented by Harry's legal team, points toward a system rather than isolated incidents. A system in which certain media outlets, motivated by access and influence, may have engaged in practices that blurred the line between reporting and manipulation. More troubling still is the implication that individuals connected to palace environments, whether formally or informally, could have played a role in how narratives were shaped and distributed. That is the point where this case stops being a media dispute and becomes a structural challenge. Because if even part of that claim holds under scrutiny, it raises uncomfortable questions about how information flows within and around one of the most tightly managed institutions in the world. The monarchy relies heavily on controlled communication. Briefings, background conversations, carefully timed disclosures, these are not new. They are part of how modern royal life is mediated to the public. But there is a clear boundary between communication and coordination with external actors in ways that could cause harm. Harry's case, at least in its most aggressive interpretation, suggests that boundary may have been crossed. From a legal perspective, this is where the stakes escalate sharply. Allegations of unlawful information gathering are not decided by public opinion. They require evidence, documents, testimonies, timelines that align under scrutiny. The court will not be persuaded by narrative coherence or emotional resonance. It will demand precision. And that creates a risk not just for those being accused, but for those making the accusations. Because if the evidence fails to support the scale of the claims, the consequences are immediate. Credibility begins to erode. Arguments that once appeared compelling start to look overstated. And in a courtroom environment, where each inconsistency is examined, even small gaps can widen into significant vulnerabilities. This is why legal analysts are watching the structure of the case as closely as its content. Early reports have already hinted at challenges, questions around delayed submissions, shifting witness accounts, and the difficulty of linking broad patterns to specific, provable actions. None of these issues are uncommon in complex litigation, but in a case this visible, they take on added weight. At the same time, the presence of other high-profile figures reportedly connected to the broader legal action adds another layer of complexity. Their involvement reframes the narrative. This is no longer just about Harry and Meghan as individuals. It becomes part of a larger conversation about media conduct, privacy rights, and the boundaries of acceptable journalistic behavior. In that sense, the case is being positioned as a kind of reckoning, a moment where long-standing practices may be tested against contemporary legal standards. But that framing is precisely what Buckingham Palace appears unwilling to endorse. By stepping back so decisively, the institution is signaling that it does not recognize this case as a collective defense of royal integrity. It is, instead, a private legal matter brought by private individuals. That distinction matters, because it prevents the case from automatically inheriting the moral authority of the monarchy itself. It also protects the institution from being drawn into a process it cannot control. Because once allegations involving potential internal connections are raised in court, the scope of inquiry can expand rapidly. Questions lead to requests. Requests lead to disclosures. And disclosures, in a system built on discretion, carry inherent risk. This is where the tension becomes most acute. On one side, Harry's team appears to be constructing an argument that reaches beyond personal grievance towards systemic critique. On the other, the palace is reinforcing boundaries, narrowing the frame, and refusing to allow the institution to become part of the evidentiary landscape. Both strategies are deliberate. Both are designed to control narrative and outcome, but they cannot fully coexist. Because if the case proceeds as described, if it continues to suggest links between media behavior and palace-adjacent figures, then the separation the palace is trying to maintain may be tested in ways that are difficult to contain. And that leads directly to the question that now hangs over everything. If the courtroom becomes the place where these claims are examined in detail, what happens when the focus shifts from institutions to individuals within them? If the focus shifts from institutions to individuals, the tension inside palace walls becomes impossible to ignore. Because while the public sees statements and silence, what unfolds behind closed doors is a far more complex mix of calculation, frustration, and personal reaction. According to multiple reports from royal correspondents and palace-adjacent sources, the internal mood is anything but neutral. There is a sense that this moment was anticipated, but not like this. Not with legal filings that edge toward implicating the broader ecosystem surrounding the monarchy. Not with language that risks pulling private relationships into public scrutiny. At the center of that reaction is King Charles III. Described as controlled for much of the past few years, his approach has largely been defined by restraint. Even after high-profile interviews, a controversial memoir, and ongoing public criticism, the palace maintained a consistent strategy: minimal response, maximum composure. But this situation appears different. Reports suggest that what has unsettled the king is not simply the existence of the legal case, but the framing of it. The implication that royal proximity or individuals connected to royal operations could be woven into allegations of coordinated narrative-shaping crosses into territory that directly touches the integrity of the institution he now leads. From that perspective, the issue is no longer personal. It becomes structural, and when the structure itself feels challenged, the response shifts. Then there is Princess Anne, whose reputation for directness is well established. Accounts from within royal circles suggest she has taken an especially uncompromising view. For her, titles are inseparable from duty. They are not tools to be deployed selectively, nor shields to be raised in moments of pressure. The idea that royal identity could be invoked in a private legal context, particularly one carrying such serious allegations, is, in that framework, fundamentally unacceptable. Her position reflects a broader principle that has long defined the monarchy's internal culture. Service comes first, and symbolism must align with responsibility. Anything that appears to invert that order risks undermining the very logic on which the institution depends. The reaction attributed to Prince William is, by contrast, described as deeply personal, because unlike the broader institutional concerns, the allegations circulating around this case touch closer to his immediate sphere. Suggestions, however indirect, that individuals linked to his household may have contributed to damaging narratives about Meghan introduce a level of proximity that is difficult to dismiss. From his perspective, this is not an abstract dispute about media conduct. It is an accusation that edges toward betrayal, and while he has remained publicly silent, sources indicate that privately, the response is far from indifferent. Silence, in this context, is not the absence of reaction. It is a decision about how and when to respond. That distinction becomes even more striking when placed alongside the approach of Catherine, Princess of Wales. Throughout the escalation of this situation, there has been no visible engagement from her. No statement, no counter-narrative, no attempt to enter the public conversation. Instead, her focus, according to scheduled appearances and reporting, remains fixed on charitable work, particularly initiatives involving children's health and long-term community support. This contrast has not gone unnoticed. On one side, a narrative driven by legal confrontation, symbolism, and public messaging. On the other, a deliberate absence from that narrative, replaced by continuity of duty and visible service. It creates a visual and thematic divide that reinforces the palace's broader strategy without requiring explicit commentary. Because in royal communication, silence can function as signal. It can indicate discipline, it can project stability, and in moments of heightened controversy, it can serve as a form of containment, refusing to amplify conflict by engaging with it directly. Yet even within that strategy, there are signs of strain. Maintaining silence becomes increasingly difficult when the nature of the allegations begins to intersect with identifiable individuals. When the abstract becomes specific, and when private relationships are drawn into public frameworks, the cost of non-engagement rises. This is where the palace faces a strategic dilemma. Respond too aggressively, and it risks validating the scale of the conflict, pulling itself deeper into the very narrative it seeks to avoid. Remain entirely silent, and it risks allowing unchallenged interpretations to take hold, particularly if they involve implications about internal conduct. So far, the approach has leaned toward controlled distance, firm institutional boundaries paired with minimal personal response. But the language used in the initial rejection suggests that this balance may be shifting. The tone was sharper, the separation more explicit, and behind that shift lies a possibility that has not yet fully surfaced in public, but is increasingly difficult to ignore. Because if the pressure continues to build, if the legal case expands, if the allegations move closer to named individuals, the palace may be forced to consider a step it has avoided until now. Not silence, not distance, but direct action. January 22nd arrives under low clouds and steady rain, and the scene outside the Royal Courts of Justice feels less like a routine hearing and more like a moment of collision. Barricades line the street. Cameras stack shoulder to shoulder. Analysts speak in clipped tones, trying to frame what is about to unfold. This is not a balcony appearance. This is not ceremony. This is the monarchy's long-running fracture, stepping into a courtroom. Meghan arrives first. Composed, deliberate, every movement measured. The visual is controlled, tailored lines, neutral palette, a presence that reads as intentional rather than reactive. It is a statement without words. Calm under pressure. Narrative in hand. Moments later, Harry appears separately. The contrast is immediate. His posture tighter, expression more guarded, the strain more visible. 2 entries, 2 signals, 1 shared stage. Inside, the atmosphere shifts from spectacle to procedure. Names are called, submissions are logged. The choreography of law begins to replace the noise outside. And then the case itself starts to take shape in front of the court. Harry's legal team outlines the core claims, patterns of intrusion, coordinated narratives, alleged links that extend beyond standard journalistic practice. The framing is ambitious. It asks the court to see not just incidents, but a system. Not just headlines, but mechanisms. It is the kind of argument that can carry weight if it is supported with precision. It is also the kind that collapses quickly if it is not. The judge begins to probe. Questions land early and without softness. Timelines are tested. Sequences are examined. Where did information originate, and how did it move? What is documented, and what is inferred? The court is not interested in tone or implication. It is interested in clarity, in consistency, in proof that holds when pressure is applied. There are moments where the answers appear to hesitate. References to material that arrives later than expected, accounts that require clarification, nothing decisive on its own but enough to introduce friction. In a case built on connecting patterns, even small points of uncertainty can slow momentum. Legal observers in the room begin to shift their focus, not away from the allegations but toward the structure supporting them. Complex cases often face this phase, a tightening of scrutiny where broad claims must resolve into specific, verifiable elements. It is where narrative meets threshold. And then comes the line that cuts through the room with quiet force. The judge reminds both sides that this court exists to examine truth, not spectacle. It is not a rebuke directed at a single party. It is a boundary statement, a signal that whatever exists outside media cycles, public perception, reputational stakes, does not determine the outcome here. The process will be slower, narrower, and far less forgiving than the narratives that surround it. At that moment, the distance between the courtroom and the public arena becomes unmistakable. Because outside, the story continues to expand commentary, analysis, competing interpretations. Inside, it contracts. Each claim must stand on its own. Each link must be demonstrated. Each assertion must survive questioning that does not bend to context. Then, a development that shifts the tone again. The court acknowledges formal submissions, clarifying that the king, the queen consort, and the Prince and Princess of Wales do not support any suggestion that the claimants are acting in defense of the royal household or its interests. The wording is precise. It does not engage with the substance of the case. It does not address the allegations directly, but it draws a clear line around representation. For anyone still reading this as a shared battle, the message is unmistakable. It is not. Additional signals, attributed through reporting to other senior members of the family, reinforce that separation. The underlying theme remains consistent personal legal action should not be framed as institutional defense. The distinction is repeated, not loudly, but with enough clarity to settle interpretation. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings continue. Arguments advance, are challenged, and recalibrated. The rhythm is deliberate. There is no sudden resolution, no dramatic reveal that resolves the tension. Instead, there is accumulation points built, questioned, and held in suspension. By the time the session draws toward a close, no verdict has been delivered. No definitive conclusion has been reached, but the tone has shifted. The case, once framed in sweeping terms, now sits under a lens that demands exactness. The distance between allegation and proof feels narrower, more exposed, and the separation between the claimants and the institution they once represented has been reinforced in the very space where outcomes will be decided. As the doors open and the sound of the outside world returns cameras, voices, the steady rhythm of rain, the image that lingers is not one of resolution, but of weight. Harry pauses briefly, caught between movement and stillness, the strain of the moment visible in a way that no statement can fully capture. Because what happened inside was not just another step in a legal process. It was a narrowing. And once a case begins to narrow under that kind of scrutiny, the next phase becomes far less predictable. Especially when the possibility now emerging is not just about what the court might decide, but about who else may decide to step in. What happens next no longer feels like a continuation, it feels like a threshold. Because once a case reaches this level of exposure, where allegations touch not just institutions but individuals, where courtroom scrutiny begins to compress broad narratives into hard questions, something else starts to move in parallel, quietly, deliberately. And, if the reports are accurate, with consequences that could extend far beyond the outcome of a single legal dispute, for the first time in this unfolding crisis, there are credible indications that King Charles III is not simply observing from a distance, that behind the palace's carefully measured language, preliminary legal considerations may already be underway. Not public action. Not yet. But preparation. That possibility changes everything, because a reigning monarch entering even indirectly into a legal confrontation involving his own son and daughter-in-law would be without modern precedent. This would not be managed through briefings or quiet distancing. It would signal that the conflict has crossed from reputational tension into something the institution believes must be formally addressed. The reasoning, as understood through multiple lines of reporting and legal analysis, is not difficult to trace. If claims made in court or in supporting narratives are perceived to damage the reputation of working royals, or to misrepresent the role of the monarchy in a way that affects public trust, the palace may feel compelled to respond not as a family, but as a constitutional entity. That distinction matters, because once the response is framed at the level of institution rather than relationship, the tone shifts from emotional to strategic, from disagreement to defense, and from private fracture to public position. At the center of this shift is a question that has been building quietly beneath the surface. How long can silence remain an effective strategy when the narrative continues to expand without constraint? For years, restraint has been the default. After interviews that reached global audiences, after publications that revealed deeply personal perspectives, after ongoing commentary that has kept the story alive across platforms, the palace has largely chosen not to engage directly. The assumption has been that stability, consistency, and time would contain the impact. But time has not closed this gap. It has widened it. And now, with legal proceedings introducing a framework where claims are examined under oath, where documentation can be requested, where testimony carries weight beyond interpretation, the calculus changes. Silence, in that environment, can begin to look less like discipline and more like exposure. This is where the possibility of action begins to take shape. Not necessarily as an immediate legal filing, not necessarily as a direct challenge, but as readiness, the kind that allows an institution to move quickly if a threshold is crossed. If statements are made that require formal rebuttal, if implications arise that cannot be left unanswered without consequence. From a strategic perspective, it is a shift from passive containment to active protection. And it does not occur in isolation, because while these considerations develop, the public narrative continues to evolve. Meghan's positioning through appearances, language, and broader brand activity remains closely watched. Supporters see consistency, a continued effort to define identity on her own terms. Critics see convergence, legal conflict, symbolic language, and commercial visibility intersecting in ways that raise questions about intent. Harry, by contrast, appears increasingly defined by the legal path he has chosen. His argument focused on accountability, on alleged patterns of conduct that he believes must be challenged, carries weight if it is substantiated, but it also carries risk. Because the higher the stakes of the claim, the higher the burden of proof. And now, those two trajectories, symbolic positioning and legal confrontation, are intersecting at the exact moment when institutional patience may be reaching its limit. Which brings us to the point where all of this converges. This is no longer a story that can return to its previous state. The ambiguity that once allowed movement between roles, public figure, private individual, royal affiliate, has been stripped away. Lines have been drawn, positions have been clarified, and the space between them has narrowed to the point where even small movements carry significant consequence. The question is no longer who is right in a general sense. That will be tested in court, through process, through evidence. The deeper question is what remains once that process is complete. If the claims hold, the implications will extend into how media operates around power. If they do not, the impact on credibility will be difficult to reverse. If the palace acts, the relationship shifts into territory that modern royal history has not had to navigate. And if it does not, the narrative continues to unfold without direct institutional counterweight. None of those paths lead back to where this began. As the days move forward, the pace may appear to slow, hearings scheduled, arguments refined, statements measured. But beneath that surface, pressure is building. Not in headlines, but in decisions that have not yet been made public. Decisions about response, about boundaries, about how far each side is willing to go. And when those decisions surface, they will not feel like incremental developments. They will feel like a turning point. Because what began as a dispute over coverage, over privacy, over personal experience, has moved into something else entirely. A test of narrative, of authority, and of how far individuals and institutions can push against each other before the structure itself begins to shift. At that point, there is no neutral ground left. Only outcomes.